I am super pleased to introduce Diane Yentel today. She is the president and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, which is a membership organization dedicated solely to achieving socially just public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes in the United States have affordable and decent homes. I have watched Diane at multiple conferences since I started my career in affordable housing 12 years ago. So this is a bit of a fangirl moment for me. She's worked at HUD, she's worked at Oxfam, she's been, boots on the ground in Massachusetts with their coalition to serve the homeless. And she's a tireless advocate for why affordable housing is important for all of us. And so I'm just thrilled that before the latter half of the meeting, where we sort of unpack tools that developers have available to them in Tulsa to develop quality affordable housing, that Diane is going to share with us, why it's so important and why to thrive as a city and a state, we need to have affordable housing for all of our neighbors. So thank you, Diane, for being here today.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I have some slides that I believe will come up momentarily. Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today, especially during such a consequential time, a time when it is clear that if we don't have a significant intervention by governments at all levels, we will face a housing crisis in our country unlike any I've ever seen in my lifetime. And so I'm going to spend my time today talking about this immediate crisis that we face and the actions that we together need to take in order to avoid this catastrophic outcome. So really, to begin to understand the crisis, the housing crisis that we face now, we have to recognize where we were even before COVID-19 came to our country. And that was in the midst of a severe affordable housing crisis, where we had a shortage of over 7 million homes affordable and available to the lowest income people. So another way of saying that same number is for every 100 of the lowest income renters, there were fewer than 40 apartments affordable and available to them. And as you can see from this map, the shortage ranges from most severe to least severe, but there is no state that has a sufficient number of homes affordable to its lowest income renters. In Oklahoma, for every 100 of the lowest income renters, there are 45 rental homes affordable and available to them. And in the state of Oklahoma, there's a shortage of over 72,000 rental homes affordable and available to those lowest income renters. And of course, also before COVID-19, nationally, we had over 550,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night. And those numbers had been increasing for the last 3 years as they have been increasing in Oklahoma. Last count in Oklahoma, there were about 4,000 people experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. So because of this shortage, rents are far out of reach for the lowest income renters. The national average for a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, which are those red bars at the bottom of that graph, that's more than what the average renter earns. And it's far more than what a person living in poverty has to pay for rent. So even before COVID-19, because of this shortage and this gap between what people earn and what rent costs, we had nearly 8 million of the lowest income renter households paying at least 50% of their income towards rent, and many were paying much more, 60, 70, 80% of their income just to have a roof over their heads. So when you have such limited income to begin with, and you're paying so much of it for your home, you are always one financial emergency away from missing rent and potentially being evicted, and in worst cases, becoming homeless. Next slide, please. So for many of these same renters, the coronavirus is that financial emergency, that financial shock. They have lost jobs, they've lost hours at work, and it's harder than ever for them to cobble together what they need in order to be able to pay the rent. And this lost wages and lost jobs, by our conservative estimate, will increase the number of extremely low income and very low income renters by at least 1.5 million households who now are competing for that same very limited number of homes affordable to them. Next slide, please. It's important to recognize that these job losses are not being felt equally. Black and Latino workers are losing jobs during COVID-19 much faster than white workers are. Black Americans are also more likely, they're more likely to be unemployed, but they're also least likely to be receiving any unemployment benefits. Just about 13% of Black people out of work in April to June received unemployment benefits, compared to about 24% of unemployed white workers. So this, on top of a whole body of research, shows us that renters of color across the US are at much higher risk of being evicted during COVID-19, just as they were at higher risk of eviction before COVID-19. Next slide, please. So if we had a system in our country to catch people when they fall off of a financial cliff related to any disaster, and especially one like COVID-19, we could better weather these challenges. But unfortunately, we don't have such a system in our country. Instead, we have a system where only 1 in every 4 households who is eligible for and needs housing assistance receives any. So about 75% of households in our country who need housing assistance and are eligible don't receive any. They are the folks who stand in line waiting to add their names to years or sometimes decades-long waiting lists, hoping to win what is essentially a housing lottery in our system, in our country, where only the lucky 25% get the help that they need. So because of this, because we have these gaping holes in our social safety net and in our housing system, we face these tremendously challenging scenarios today. Like, what happens when people sleeping in encampments without access to hot water or soap face a pandemic? Or what happens when millions of people are on the cusp of losing their homes, when our collective health depends on our ability to stay home? So if nothing else, this pandemic really drives home the truth that housing is healthcare. And we recognize that we cannot truly contain this pandemic as long as hundreds of thousands of people remain unhoused and unsheltered, and especially if we allow tens of millions more people to lose their homes. Next slide, please. So the current crises really show us what systemic racism looks like. And these current crises have heightened the threat of eviction for Black and Latino renters, but these risks are not new, right? Decades of structural racism in housing policies, from redlining to blockbusting, restrictive covenants to restrictive zoning, has purposefully put homeownership out of reach for many Black American families. That's created this yawning wealth gap in our country that exists today, where the average white family holds 12 times the wealth as the average Black family. This creates tremendous racial disparities in housing and homelessness. So structural racism leaves Black and Latino people disproportionately likely to be renters, disproportionately likely to be rent burdened, disproportionately likely to be extremely low income, and disproportionately likely to be homeless. For years in Oklahoma City, the rate of Black residents there's been a disproportionate rate of Black residents experiencing homelessness. In Oklahoma City, about 26% of people experiencing homelessness are Black, but Black people make up only about 15% of the population. So these inequities compound the harm done by COVID-19. Black and Native Americans are bearing the brunt of infections and fatalities. Black and Latino workers are bearing the brunt of these historic job losses. And now their homes, and with it, their ability to stay safe and healthy, are at risk. So I think these facts really both heighten the urgency for action to prevent this wave of evictions that will be predominantly Black and brown renters. It also makes clear our obligation to center racial equity in the solutions, to use the tens of billions of dollars that are flowing into communities across the country to ensure not only that we don't reinforce or worsen racial inequities, but that we use these funds to work to undo them and to alleviate some of the inequities. Next slide, please. So the solutions to all of this are pretty simple, even if they're not easy, right? We have to protect and house people who are experiencing homelessness. We have to prevent more people from becoming homeless, and we have to center racial equity in our response to the housing needs created by the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So the CARES Act, enacted in March, was a good start. It provided more than $12 billion in funding for HUD programs and $150 billion in coronavirus relief fund. And it created a limited federal eviction moratorium that protected about 30% of renters in certain properties across the country. Next slide, please. But now, the CARES Act protections and most of its resources have expired. So the CARES Act federal eviction moratorium expired at the end of July, and most governors across the country have allowed temporary state and local eviction moratoriums to expire. The Oklahoma governor never issued a statewide eviction moratorium, but the state Supreme Court paused most evictions through May 15th. And according to an Oklahoma court tracker, more than 2,000 evictions were filed across the state during that time, between March and May 15th. And even before the pandemic, Tulsa rated number 11 and Oklahoma City rated number 20 in a ranking of the top 100 US cities for evictions. So before the COVID-19 outbreak, Oklahoma County was on track to have about 14,000 eviction cases this year. And now the Legal Aid Services of Oklahoma estimates there could be as many as 130,000 people at risk of losing their homes from eviction if Congress doesn't provide additional resources and protection for those renters. So many cities and states have put the CARES Act funds to good use, creating some emergency rental assistance programs. We're tracking all of them around the country. There's about 350 of them at last count, including Oklahoma State's eviction prevention program and 3 other state and local programs in Oklahoma. But they, like just about all of the emergency rental assistance programs across the country, have one thing in common, and that is that demand for these resources far outstrips the availability of them. Next slide, please. So we need much more action from policymakers at all levels. And the good news is that this eviction crisis is not only entirely predictable, as we have been predicting it for almost 6 months now, it's also completely preventable. But the bad news is that preventing it actually requires Congress and the White House to agree on how to do so. But the solutions here too are pretty simple, even if they're not easy. We need a national uniform moratorium on evictions for non-payment of rent for the duration of the pandemic. The very least the federal government ought to do, really governments at all levels ought to do in the middle of a pandemic, is assure each of us that we're not going to lose our homes in the middle of it. But eviction moratoriums on their own aren't enough. They create a financial cliff for renters to fall off of when back rent is due and they're no more able to pay it than they are now, or they were at the beginning of the pandemic. So we are also pushing for the federal government to provide at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance and eviction prevention to keep renters stably housed during and after the pandemic, and to provide really essential rental income to small landlords so that they can continue to pay their bills and continue to maintain and operate their properties. And we need at least $11.5 billion to homeless shelter and service providers to keep people experiencing homelessness safe, healthy, and to get them housed as quickly as possible. So together, these protections would stem the tide of evictions. They were all included in the HEROES Act that passed in the House back in May, 4 months ago. But unfortunately, negotiations with the Senate and the White House fell apart, and the next steps and actions are, excuse me, are very unclear. Next slide, please. So thankfully, in the meantime, the CDC implemented a national eviction moratorium. This was very badly needed to prevent what we were already seeing as a wave of evictions across the country. But this CDC moratorium is different from the previous moratorium under the CARES Act, because while that moratorium was only covered about 30% of renters, it was automatic for those renters. This covers a much broader array of renters, but only if they take action to receive that protection. They have to meet certain eligibility requirements. They have to submit a declarative statement to their landlords, and then they are protected from eviction through the end of the year. We're finding that many renters are not aware of this moratorium and of the action that they need to take in order to receive this protection. So unfortunately, even after this moratorium was implemented, we are seeing some evictions, too many evictions moving forward. So I would urge all of you to do everything you can to ensure that renters know about this protection and take the action that they need to stay housed. But ultimately, this eviction moratorium, as badly needed as it is, it's a half measure. It doesn't actually prevent evictions. It merely postpones them until the end of December, when this moratorium expires, because even during the moratorium, rent is still due and late fees and other penalties can be attached to that rent. And we are talking about saddling low-income renters with more debt than they can possibly pay off. So if policymakers don't act, we will see a tremendous wave of evictions. And now we'll be in the middle of winter when COVID-19 is expected to be even worse. So we really have to do everything we can to prevent that from happening. Next slide, please. So the stakes could not be higher right now. It's very clear that without significant intervention, there will be a wave of evictions and a spike in homelessness across the country. And in fact, in many ways, that wave has already begun, and we need to act to prevent it from becoming a tsunami on January 1st, when we will be out of time. When our collective health depends on our ability to stay in our homes, we all have a stake in ensuring that tens of millions of people don't lose theirs. So ensuring that everyone is stably housed during and after the pandemic, it's not only a moral imperative, it is a public health emergency necessity. Next slide, please. So I just want to end with an image that I think about often, because it says so much about how we respond to homelessness and housing poverty in our country and the work that we have to do, right? This picture is from Las Vegas in probably like mid-April. There was a local homeless shelter that had to close its doors after an employee became infected with COVID-19. And in response, the city moved all of the people that had been sleeping in that shelter onto these open air concrete slabs, carefully placed 6 feet apart. And this is in Las Vegas, so they are literally sleeping in the shadow of dozens of empty hotel buildings. So I think about this often, and I share it with all of you because it encapsulates so many things about our country's ongoing failure to respond in any meaningful way to homelessness, about the cruel and sometimes dehumanizing ways that some communities treat people experiencing homelessness, and about the work that we have to do towards long-term solutions. Because to end where I started, the immediate housing crisis we are working to prevent sits on top of a long-standing and pervasive shortage of affordable homes for the lowest income people. You know, we had an affordable housing crisis in our country before COVID-19, and we will have it after COVID-19. Unless we are willing as a country to make the kind of sustained and significant investments needed in long-term solutions, then we will face this eviction crisis again during the next pandemic or the next wave of this pandemic, during the next natural disaster, or even during the next year, because we still will not have solved for the underlying shortage of homes affordable to the lowest income people. And there too, the long-term solutions are also pretty simple, even if they're not easy. We need significant and sustained funding to build apartments affordable to the lowest income people through the National Housing Trust Fund or deeply targeted low-income housing tax credits. We need to bridge the gap between what people earn and what rent costs through rental assistance. We need emergency cash assistance and eviction prevention. And certainly we need to preserve our country's existing public and other affordable housing stock. You know, allowing homelessness and housing poverty to exist in our country has always been a public policy choice, and we can instead choose to end it. We have the data, the solutions, and as a country, certainly we have the resources. The only thing we lack, what we have always lacked, is the political will to fund the solutions at the scale needed. And maybe this moment, when it's never been more clear that housing is healthcare, maybe this moment helps us build that political will to achieve lasting change. So I'll stop there. The next slide has my contact information if you want to put that up. I'm always happy to hear from people. And